Now, for some context, I got into Resident Evil with the original 1, 2, and 3 a while later in the early 2000s. This was before Resident Evil 4, but still years after these games actually came out and after gaming in general was really moving away from the kinds of games they were making in the 90s. So maybe that says something about my perspective on all this. Because most people will tell you combat wasn't the point of the original Resident Evil games before RE4. And with the tank controls and the fixed camera angles and how limited the game made things like ammo and healing items, this was mostly pretty accurate. The older games made you a lot more careful every time you had to fight something in almost every way you can think of. Even just the janky controls and the camera angles really gave you the sense of being anxious and overwhelmed, a lot like the actual characters who were stumbling into a zombie apocalypse and were fighting just to survive. Then on top of that, having to make sure you could scrounge and try and save as many rounds and herbs you could find to actually make it through the game while only having enough inventory to even carry so many items and weapons in the first place only made this more dire and desperate. So the kind of risks and limits with actually fighting them really encouraged you to try and avoid the flesh-eating monsters that could rip your face off a lot of the time. But the thing is, even then, I'd still argue even the very first Resident Evil game revolved a whole lot more around action and combat than most survival horror games. The RE games were always more of an action game than some people realized. Because unlike Silent Hill or something like the Amnesia games, Resident Evil always placed a lot more emphasis on fighting or killing the monsters with as much violence and badass action shit the devs could reasonably pull off. The very first game gives you a literal arsenal of like 7 different guns and grenade launchers and flamethrowers on top of a knife you can already go full Rambo with from start to finish. So it wasn't exactly subtle about trying to push a certain level of action. And then to go with this, the entire first game takes place inside a zombie-infested mansion filled with tons of narrow hallways and tiny rooms enclosed in spaces. And the game threw so many different types of enemies at you with so many different tactics and strategies to them inside these narrow spaces that a lot of other times, most players still found it easier to just fight their way through no matter how janky the combat was. In so many situations, the game was outright pushing you to use these weapons to kill as many zombies as you could. And even if you went out of your way to avoid combat, the game was still constantly throwing these at you and making you at least think about all the different ways you might have to kill all the different monsters it was throwing at you. So even though you can avoid combat, the game still shows you and gives you so many ways and so much over-the-top firepower to fight and kill zombies that you're actually a lot more encouraged to resort to combat than you are in most of these kinds of games. And no matter how much you avoid combat, the one thing you can't avoid is the boss fights. And in 90% of Resident Evil boss fights, the game 100% puts its focus on unleashing as much damage or violence or 80s movie action as possible with what they give you. While other survival horror games go for boss fights that are a lot simpler and are really only there to add more horror and dread and psychological tension to the game, most RE boss fights are a lot more over the top and focus a lot more on action or combat. You're really encouraged to use your most devastating weapons and do as much damage as possible. And these are such a major part of these games that for a lot of people, they're actually the most memorable things that define entire games. And even when you were just doing a knife-only run or with the fights that are a lot more environmental and scripted, the whole design of every single encounter is still a lot more excitement-driven and focused on dealing as much damage as possible to beat the giant monster instead of just surviving it. I mean, the first game even ends with you being given a fucking rocket launcher and blasting the final boss to literal pieces like it was a B-movie action flick, and this actually became a reoccurring ending in Resident Evil games. So like I said, even the very first game wasn't exactly subtle about putting more emphasis on the action. And you know what? I'd even say the same thing applies to the cutscenes and the story. The very first scene of RE1 is a bunch of elite cops who have to shoot their way to safety running from zombie dogs like it's a B-movie action flick. And while most survival horror games have protagonists who are basically just regular people, most of the Resident Evil protagonists are soldiers or cops or people who are explicitly trained for combat. So all around, a more action-focused survival horror was pretty much just the direction Resident Evil was always going for as a franchise. The classic games were definitely more focused on survival horror, but even those spent so much time pushing combat or the thought of it in your face that a lot of fans even just preferred playing them as action games. A lot of people actually preferred doing the kill everything runs or just shooting their way through the game and killing as many zombies as possible. Because no matter how janky or discouraging it was, classic RE combat was still a lot easier than what you usually got in survival horror games. The enemies were actually predictable enough and manageable enough, and it was a lot more fun because there were so many ways to fight and so many encounters that outright incentivized a straight-up Rambo shoot-em-up action sequence. Which is probably why die-hard survival horror fans of other franchises have been complaining they couldn't really get into them because they're more action games than horror games for decades now. But overall, this is why I think having a side of the franchise that explores and leans more into action makes sense. Personally, I even think it's a good thing, because if you want to talk about the narrative side, or more likely just the pretentious pseudo intellectual side I'm reading into it, the entire story of Resident Evil revolves around the dormant or inherent evil within people. The viruses and the worldwide schemes to unleash them are all just a vehicle for the kind of evil driving each character who gets infected, and each character actually conspiring to make it happen. From stripping away people's humanity and leaving a violent, soulless husk that just wants to consume and hunt and dominate, to people trying to evolve or change humanity itself without any conscience and throwing away most of their humanity themselves. So, in terms of the main characters and what they actually do in the story, the survival horror in these games represents coming face to face with this kind of evil and surviving it and having to deal with it. But then the action horror, that's also always been a major part of these games, also represents actually fighting back and standing up to it and challenging it head on. And since this has always been such a big part of the franchise since the beginning, it's kind of expected later games would eventually try and take this further. But more importantly, games that lean more into action are just more fun. And whatever else it is, Resident Evil is a franchise about being badass and blowing up zombies. You might think that sounds unsophisticated, but we're already talking about a bunch of video games about killing zombies. So you have to already be a little open-minded about what's actually good and bad instead of these surface-level overviews in the first place. And you know what? For a lot of people, Resident Evil is a beloved franchise that's a lot more than that, but I'm not saying this to try and minimize it or denigrate it. I'm a fan of it. I've been a Resident Evil fan for a long time. But the way I see it, people look to Resident Evil the way people used to look to Terminator movies before those started turning to shit. When it comes to horror games, Silent Hill is a franchise that tries to be more like Blade Runner in terms of being thoughtful and slower paced and introspective. But Resident Evil has always been more of a thriller. It's always been there to excite and entertain more than to make you think or give you nightmares. That doesn't mean it can't do both, but a lot of people still come to it expecting to be more indulged. And if it wants to work in deeper subtexts or a broader kind of experience, it has to do it along the way. And really, both of these are perfectly valid approaches to media that just do different things. Neither one is inherently better than the other. And personally, this is why RE4 was one of my favorite games in the franchise. There are some people who really don't like it, but to me, 4 was the perfect next step for everything I just mentioned. Because of all the Resident Evil games, 4 was the absolute best we ever got in terms of blending action and survival horror together. It was the game that actually proved this could work perfectly in a Resident Evil game. Along with 2 and 7, 4 was probably one of the most successful RE games ever released, but it's also the game a lot of die-hard classic RE fans consider the beginning of the end. One they hate with a burning passion because to them, this was where Resident Evil started leaning more and more into action and basically started making it easier and easier to kill the infected rather than making you run away from them. And again, in terms of action horror, there are kind of two sides to this. There's everything I just went over, which might explain or just goes on top of the fact that the majority of Resident Evil fans were completely on board with at least RE4. It's one of the best received and best selling games in the franchise, and the majority of fans liked what it was trying to do with Resident Evil at the time. Which, when you had a franchise that was already leaning on combat around the same time gaming in general was leaning more and more into action across the board, was kind of unavoidable. But on the other hand, people who were more into the survival horror or maybe didn't even like all the gunplay and combat in the first place really didn't like what 4 was doing or the kind of trend it was setting for later games. Most people think 5 and 6 and a lot of the games that came after pretty much forgot about horror completely and just kept dialing up the action until there was basically nothing left to be afraid of anymore. Until the literal flesh-eating monsters that used to rip your face off if you weren't careful pretty much stopped giving you any sense of dread or anxiety and basically just turned into generic cannon fodder you could mow down. And while most of this is centered on 5 and 6, some people even think 4 ruined the survival horror just by letting Leon fight more aggressively or giving players more freedom they didn't have before. And really, this is where I'm a lot more in the middle, because in my opinion, B-movie action and violence have always been one of the low-key cornerstones of the franchise. I definitely think you can do Resident Evil with a lot of action. But at the same time, I definitely think you can overdo it, and more importantly, really ignore the more fundamental parts of the franchise, because that's exactly what RE5 and RE6 did. And for me personally, Resident Evil 5 and 6 were literal trash. If you're one of the people who used to watch my other videos, maybe you're surprised, because I've talked up games a lot of people really don't like, but there's no fucking way I'm shilling for RE5 and RE6. And again, I know on the other side there are a lot of people who love 5 and 6 and prefer those kinds of games to the other ones. This is probably why the CGI movies produced by Capcom basically embody 5 and 6, but again, all this is just my opinion. There are things I like about 5 and 6, more 5 than 6 really, and with better writing, I even think a lot of the gameplay problems wouldn't matter as much. But overall, 5 and 6 just felt like the most generic, over-the-top shooter games that really got rid of most of the things that actually gave Resident Evil its identity in the first place. But 4 is where Resident Evil found the perfect middle ground. It was definitely different from classic Resident Evil, but in terms of blending action with survival horror, 4 undoubtedly did the best we ever saw and really proved you can mix these things together while still maintaining the original character of Resident Evil. RE4 really let Leon let loose and really made the B-movie action a lot more central and visceral and deliberate, but still kept enough of the horror and the survival elements to really keep you on edge and keep the tension running high from start to finish. Leon goes from a rookie cop to Jason Bourne getting tips from the Winter Soldier. He can easily go 1v3 or 1v4 with the Ganados. And with a knife and a pistol, he can just go to town on an entire village square of infected freaks like he's the star of John Wick Z or some shit. This was basically when the game started acting like doing those knife-only runs and the originals were actually supposed to be taken seriously. It was the story outright telling you this is supposed to be a thing these characters can actually do. But even then, the game was still always making you think about survival. You still constantly had to manage ammo and think about healing and conserving your resources. And even with all the guns and all the new combat moves, enemies were still very, very dangerous and could easily chew through your health and just mob you and kill you the moment you made a mistake or got too confident. And fighting was still so risky and so costly, you still had to constantly think about whether it was better to fight or just run for your life. And in terms of horror, the infected villagers and the cult and everything they were doing with Las Plagas actually seemed very sinister and unnerving and gave you a real sense you were dealing with something disturbingly inhuman. Everything about them in the setting was legitimately creepy and felt disturbingly unnatural. Throughout the whole story, there was a real sense of dread and being completely overwhelmed. It always made sure the infected and the conspiracies felt dangerous and real and unsettling on an instinctive, primal level instead of letting them seem like generic, sterilized bad guys who were two-dimensionally evil without making you feel afraid of them. In fact, in terms of keeping this overall balance and just proving it's actually possible, I even think the 4 remake did a better job than the original. Just taking a more serious tone overall really made the tension and the desperation and the instinctive primal horror elements more noticeable even with all the action movie combat. It's still a pretty different experience from the originals. But for anyone who says 4 isn't scary enough for a horror game, I'd say 90% of the horror is right there but just presented a different way. You definitely don't feel as powerless or vulnerable as you did in 1, 2, and 3. But even then, the game still made you feel just as helpless and overwhelmed on a much broader, psychological kind of level. Even with larger maps and even a relatively more open world system that left you less cornered and less trapped, the entire atmosphere of the setting still made you feel anxious and uncomfortable and unsafe 90% of the time, just like being trapped in the mansion of the police station in 1 and 2. The general vibe might feel like it's leaning more into excitement rather than terror, but I'd argue the original RE3 was already doing that. 3 was the game that already proved Resident Evil could be a fast-paced thriller and still maintain its overall identity as a horror game. And in both cases, even with new mechanics that gave you more survivability, 3 and 4 were still able to keep the same overall dread and anxiety that constantly kept you on edge of watching your character die a horrible, gruesome death throughout the game. And in terms of jump scares and a more visceral kind of horror, there were even some areas 4 went even further than the originals. Because just with the new game engine, the kind of grotesque body horror we saw in 4 was even more extreme than anything we were getting in 1, 2, or 3. And with 4 and 3, the new mechanics even made some of the jump scare moments more intense. Because on top of suddenly throwing enemies at you out of nowhere, the game started making you use these new mechanics to run or fight for your life in full-blown sequences that were 100 times more intense. But then on the other end, if you're a 5 and 6 fan who doesn't like the older games or toned down combat, then in all likelihood, the RE4 approach probably still does more for you than the people who don't like combat. Because if you're into the action, RE4 still gives you a shit ton of action. And while survival horror, and by extension its purists, are a lot more particular, action games as a genre are a lot broader and more varied and mixed to begin with. And since the overwhelming majority of RE fans like 4 across the board, I'm assuming we're talking about smaller groups here either way. But personally, I've never met a fan of 5 or 6 who didn't like 4. And even though I'm sure there are people who feel this way, I've never even heard of anyone saying they won't play it because there was too much horror or because the survival mechanics bogged down combat. Overall, I think most action fans are on board with the RE4 formula. But either way, all this just shows the RE4 approach was the closest Resident Evil ever got to exploring both sides of the franchise at the same time. I think 4 was the closest RE ever got to a perfect balance of action and horror that we really haven't seen again since, which is why it's pretty sad it took till 9 for them to finally at least try and come back to this. Because whether you liked it or hate it, 4 at least proved this was a very viable approach to a Resident Evil game on its own for at least the majority of RE fans.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?